Do you remember what Chris Tucker represented at the turn of the millennium? Not just a comedian, but a force. A velocity. A sound that arrived before you could prepare for it. His voice was high, fast, unfiltered, almost reckless. He didn't pause for approval. He didn't slow down to be understood. He barreled through scenes the way storms cut across open water. Loud, sudden, impossible to ignore. Chris Tucker didn't feel curated. He felt unleashed. At a time when Hollywood still ran on carefully shaped personas, Tucker arrived like a disruption. He wasn't polished. He wasn't dignified. He wasn't safe. And that was exactly the point. Smokey wasn't just funny. He was uncontrollable. And audiences loved him for that. So here's the question that refuses to go away, even decades later. How does a man at the absolute peak of Hollywood power simply disappear? Without scandal, without collapse, without failure, without explanation. Not fade. Not stumble. Not fall. Disappear. For years, fans asked quietly. They assumed maturity. They assumed faith. They assumed personal growth. They told themselves the story that made the most sense. Until early 2024, when that silence was interrupted, not by a lawsuit or a documentary, but by a conversation. A conversation that didn't accuse, didn't indict, didn't prove, but reframed everything. And once it was reframed, it couldn't be unseen. The moment everything shifted, the setting itself mattered. This wasn't a stage. There were no flashing lights. No laugh track to soften the edges. Just a stripped-down podcast studio. Two men across from each other. One asking questions. The other answering slowly, deliberately, with the confidence of someone who believed timing mattered more than volume. Katt Williams sat calmly. Sunglasses on. Cognac glass in hand. Not performing. Dissecting. For nearly 3 hours, he spoke with a kind of surgical patience that felt unfamiliar to audiences used to his explosive delivery. This was not stand-up. This was testimony without a courtroom. The conversation drifted through the past. Old films, old jokes, old legends. Nostalgia softened the room. When Shannon Sharpe mentioned the possibility of another Friday installment, it felt like a warm detour. A memory lane moment. A respectful nod to actors who were no longer alive. A pause. Then Katt cut through it. No raised voice. No punchline. No smile. He said that the Chris Tucker people remembered, the Smokey version, was gone. Not evolved. Not refined. Gone. And then he said 2 words that landed heavier than any joke could have. Epstein Island. The room didn't explode. It tightened. The air shifted in a way audiences could feel through their screens. The casual tone evaporated. What followed wasn't entertainment anymore. It was implication. So pause here and ask something important. Why did that single reference carry so much weight? Why did it instantly reframe decades of silence into something else entirely? Because Epstein's name doesn't exist in isolation. It drags context with it. Power, secrecy, observation, and the unsettling truth that proximity alone can change a person, even when no crime occurs. Smokey wasn't a role. He was a condition. Katt Williams didn't talk about Smokey like a character in a script. He talked about Smokey like a state of being. Smokey was unfiltered, unapologetic, uncontained. He didn't fear consequences because he didn't calculate them. He spoke before thinking, moved before permission. That kind of energy isn't taught. It's tolerated until it isn't. Hollywood loved that energy at first. It sold tickets. It generated quotable moments. It felt authentic in an industry obsessed with control. But authenticity has a shelf life. What happens when an industry built on leverage encounters someone too free? They don't confront you directly. They don't destroy you publicly. They reshape you. They teach you the cost of being uncontained. Katt suggested something subtle but devastating. That what disappeared wasn't Chris Tucker's talent, it was his risk. His unpredictability. The part of him that couldn't be managed. And when someone like that sees how power really works, behind closed doors, without scripts, freedom stops feeling safe. Religion, or retreat. For years, Chris Tucker has given the same explanation. He stepped away because he didn't want to promote drugs, vulgarity, or destructive behavior. He found faith. He became a born-again Christian. He wanted cleaner work. On the surface, that story feels complete. Admirable, even. But Katt Williams asked a question many people had quietly avoided. Who walks away from a 9-figure career at its peak purely because of a moral awakening? After Rush Hour 2, Tucker was earning $25 million per film. That wasn't just success, it was leverage. Studios don't hand out that kind of money without expectation. And yet he stopped. No meltdown. No lawsuit. No box office failure. Just withdrawal. So the question becomes uncomfortable. Was religion the reason, or the cover? Katt didn't claim hypocrisy. He implied fear. Not fear of sin, but fear of a system that doesn't allow clean exits once you've seen too much. Faith, in that context, isn't escape. It's armor. The Michael Jackson parallel. Then the conversation turned, and it turned carefully. Michael Jackson. Chris Tucker and Michael Jackson weren't casually acquainted. They were publicly close. Travel companions. Defenders. Appearances together that went beyond industry networking. But Katt focused on something small. Something that stuck. Michael Jackson called Chris Tucker Christmas. On its face, it sounds affectionate, innocent, a playful nickname. But Michael Jackson didn't trust easily. He lived surrounded by handlers, contracts, and constant surveillance, emotional and literal. His world was not one where intimacy was given freely. So why that nickname? What did it signify? Safety, comfort, recognition. And here's the deeper question Katt didn't need to ask directly. What kind of industry creates bonds like that, and then dismantles them in silence? Michael Jackson learned, publicly and painfully, how quickly perception could be weaponized. How fame offers no protection once the narrative turns. Chris Tucker watched that happen in real time. And maybe he learned the lesson privately. When Epstein enters the frame. As Katt's interview spread across the internet, another story was unfolding in parallel. Court documents tied to Jeffrey Epstein were being unsealed. Flight logs. Depositions. Names. And among them, Chris Tucker's name appeared. This is where precision matters. Flight logs do not prove crimes. They do not prove intent. They prove proximity. According to sworn testimony from Epstein's pilot, Tucker flew multiple times on Epstein's private aircraft. In 2002, he traveled to Africa alongside other powerful figures, with Epstein providing transportation. Chris Tucker has acknowledged this trip. He has explained it. And it must be said clearly. There is no public evidence that Chris Tucker committed any crime. There is no proof he ever visited Epstein's island. There is no accusation supported by documentation. But Katt Williams wasn't arguing guilt. He was arguing exposure. People don't come back the same. Katt's most unsettling idea wasn't about illegality. It was about psychology. He suggested that Epstein's world wasn't only about participation. It was about observation. About seeing how power behaves when there are no consequences. When rules vanish. When money insulates. When silence is bought, not earned. And once you witness that, once you understand how fragile reputation really is, your relationship with visibility changes. Silence becomes strategy. Clean images become defense. Distance becomes survival. Look at Chris Tucker after the early 2000s. Measured. Careful. Controlled. Always smiling. Never spontaneous. Never reckless again. So ask yourself honestly, does that look like peace, or restraint? The career that doesn't add up. Chris Tucker's post. 2001 career doesn't resemble retirement. It doesn't resemble burnout. It resembles withdrawal. Over more than 2 decades, his appearances are sparse. Calculated. Never returning to the kind of roles that made him untouchable. He reportedly turned down enormous sums to revisit Friday. Not because of money, but because he no longer wanted to portray weed culture. That explanation makes sense. Until you ask the harder question. Was it about values, or about distance from a former identity that felt dangerous to revisit? Smokey wasn't just a character. Smokey was a liability. Silence as a survival skill. When Katt Williams' remarks went viral, Chris Tucker didn't respond. No rebuttal. No clarification. No counter-interview. Just silence. And silence in Hollywood is rarely accidental. So the final question lingers, not as an accusation, but as a reflection. If Smokey didn't fade, if he didn't mature, if faith wasn't the whole story, what did Chris Tucker see that made disappearing feel safer than speaking? The lesson hidden in plain sight. There comes a moment in every era when people realize something uncomfortable. Fame doesn't protect you. It exposes you. Once that realization sets in, the smartest people don't fight the system. They step back. Michael Jackson learned that lesson publicly, painfully, irreversibly. Chris Tucker may have learned it quietly, and survived. At first glance, their names don't seem to belong together. One was the most famous entertainer on earth. The other was one of the most electric comedians Hollywood ever produced. Yet their paths crossed at a moment when power stopped being abstract and became visible. Both names appeared in Epstein's orbit. Both denied wrongdoing. Both insisted their presence was incidental. And both, in different ways, stepped away from the kind of freedom that once defined them. So maybe the Rayall story isn't about guilt. Maybe it's about what happens after you realize how easily a legend can be dismantled, without proof, without trial, without mercy. Not destroyed by scandal. Not erased by failure. Just contained. And once you understand that containment is possible, how loudly would you keep speaking? They called him Marcus Vail until the name grew too heavy to carry. Marcus had been invented by an industry that needed a star. Born brilliant, practiced, polished, distilled into the shape of a global myth. His voice was taught to slide under your ribs. His moves were choreographed to bend memory. When the cameras loved a person enough, the world decided those people were worth protecting, packaging, and eventually, sometimes, crucifying. By the time the trials and counter-trials finished and the cameras had moved on to fresher savagery, Marcus's body had endured the legal gauntlet. The verdicts came and the headlines clarified nothing. The damage to a public self, however, is not measured in facts or acquittals. It's measured in the currency of imagination. What people could now imagine about him and, therefore, no longer had to accept as truth. Eli Knox had watched the decline up close. Not close like a juror or a prosecutor. Close like a friend who knows the way someone laughs in private, who has seen them flinch when the wrong name surfaces, who has observed the slow, deliberate choreography of self-protection. That proximity matters in ways that are difficult to explain on paper. What did Eli learn watching Marcus disintegrate in public and yet keep breathing in the private rooms? That was the question people who cared about performance, about the combustible alchemy of risk and charisma, could not stop asking. Others had hard opinions. Some believed the worst. Some defended Marcus with a ferocity that made headlines feel insincere. But Eli was someone who had discovered, gradually and with a giddy shock, that the performance that once defined his life required a different currency once the world turned crueler. Rhett King said things that sounded like riddles. He had the habit of speaking sideways, half parable, half warning, and when he referenced Eli's life, his words landed like stones into a still pond. "You're a different person," he said once, voice soft between sets. "Not bad. Not broken. Just learned." Rhett never offered details. He didn't need to. The implication was the tool. The assertion would have been a sledgehammer. He leaned into metaphor because metaphor protects as much as it reveals. In an environment where the law is a blunt instrument and the rumor mill a razor, saying less accomplishes more. After Marcus, Eli didn't crash. He retreated. Not because he'd been proven guilty of anything. Again, the judicial record said what the judicial record said. But because retreat was a strategy that protected what he still had. Family, fortune, reputation, inner peace. Retreat could be chosen the way a soldier chooses to fall back to safer ground to preserve forces for a future offensive. It could also be chosen because you could not bear another day under the microscope. What did retreat cost him? At his peak, Eli was one of the highest-paid entertainers in the country. He'd been a human comet, incandescent, noisy, unavoidable. He turned down offers that would have kept him on the throne. When studios pounded on his agent's door, he shook his head in a way that looked almost religious, a private conviction expressed as refusal. The persona that had made him famous, the reckless, explosive, mercilessly funny performer who broke the seams of polite conversation, was recast into a man of selective appearances. Small charity gigs, solemn interviews about faith, tightly controlled stage shows that reinstated his earlier brilliance but deducted its teeth. Why do some people walk away from fame even though fame buys almost anything else a person might want? Perhaps the simplest answer is faith. Eli had talked about God, redemption, clarity. He had found a moral map that no longer permitted him to play with ugliness merely because it sold. In the old world, shock and outre choices were currency. In the new rubric, a different ledger mattered. But that explanation is too tidy for the messy real life of a performer. Plenty of artists find religion and continue to court risk. Plenty of believers remain wild. Something else had shifted inside Eli. Visibility itself became suspect. Once your name is whispered around certain rooms where power is opaque and favors are counted like currency, the way the industry treats you changes. Not always with malice. Often with fear. Not accusations, precisely, but a careful way of centering a conversation that minimizes you. And so Eli's world shrank without any bulletin from the studios. No one shone a light. No one had to. The effect was quieter, almost surgical. Certain personalities faded into muted versions of themselves. They didn't vanish. They didn't file for bankruptcy. They simply traded their appetite for risk for a price. Freedom. Rhett had watched this happen to people beyond Eli. He had been careful to survive differently, building an independent circuit, cultivating crowds that came for him, not the imprimatur of corporate gatekeepers. Where others relied on executives and distribution deals, Rhett cultivated direct relationships with audiences. That independence meant he could speak more freely, because his livelihood didn't depend on the same fragile bridges. People forget who holds power, he said once in a clipped, tired tone. It's not the press. It's not the courts. It's the network of favors. And favors can cut two ways. Rhett didn't accuse. He illuminated. He also recognized that saying the unsayable was itself a dangerous occupation. He used implication to force listeners to align dots without drawing the defamatory line. The truth about power is rarely embodied as a single villain. It's diffuse, a set of preferences, an infrastructure of habits, an enforcement mechanism that doesn't need to be named because it's internalized. The industry, in this telling, becomes an ecosystem designed to reduce volatility. It tolerates brilliance until brilliance threatens the equilibrium. Then it calms it, repackages it, or banishes it quietly. Eli's retreat became instructive. It showed that punishment comes in forms that don't require a judge. It can be administered by an array of incentives and disincentives. You don't have to be convicted to be neutered. What did Eli give up? The edges of his art, public improvisation, the fearlessness that produced his best 2 or 3 performances, were traded for predictability. He took fewer risks, said fewer things that might be remixed into scandal, and chose roles that would not catastrophize his past. He accepted safety because it secured the rest. Why would one of the most daring performers of a generation wait decades to return, and then only under conditions that posed minimal threat to anything he had once been? Because the system had taught him consequences without filing indictments. Because seeing someone like Marcus endure public fire teaches you that survival looks less like a fight than a long, careful walk. When Eli reappeared after years away, what he offered the world was a veteran's show. A restrained stand-up set, a film that relied on old chemistry, a handful of television interviews that reaffirmed he was present and serene. The laugh was still there, but the reckless sparks that once lit the room were tempered. The crowd was content. The industry was relieved. And yet the audience who had loved him for danger felt the absence. They felt privately that they were seeing not the original artist but a relic polished for safety. What does survival extract from a person? This is the deeper question Rhett seemed to be posing with his half-metaphors. When you're taught to perform within a narrow corridor of acceptability, your currency is no longer talent alone. It's reputation management. You must be always on brand, never surprising in a way that invites scrutiny, always capable of being defended by the smallest army of publicists. But there is another view, less cynical, more human. Retreat can be chosen to preserve the self for the people you love. Many performers who step back do so because the math of exposure becomes corrosive. Fame is a mirror held to the world. Sometimes the mirror is useful. Sometimes it reveals corners of your life you'd rather not have dissected. There's no one answer that fits everyone. Each story is a knot of choices, accidents, loyalties, and pressures. That is why the pattern is both cruel and, in a sense, inevitable. Look at the mechanics. Someone emerges as a cultural force. Their fame collects people, friends, managers, enablers, predators, protectors. They move through institutions that commodify them. Then a rupture occurs. Allegation, scandal, public gossip. The institutions respond in a variety of ways. Some with fireworks, some with denial, most with calculation. The individual, if they survive intact physically and legally, is asked to choose how much of themselves can remain in public view without becoming a liability. Eli chose a version of himself that would not inflict collateral harm. That choice is both noble and incomplete. It secured his family and allowed him to breathe again. It also starved the public of the risk-taking that had made him spectacular. Rhett's rhetoric drilled further into this paradox. He appeared on late-night panels with a wry, dangerous smile and would say, "When you are shown the machinery, it changes you." The machinery he referred to was a complex architecture of quid pro quos, hush funds, friendships that were actually investments. Once you see it, you know the price of daring. What, then, is the lost art that the industry quietly consumed? Risk. Not the careless kind that hurts people, but creative risk. The willingness to step off the cliff and see what the audience does. That appetite for danger used to be central to art making. When it disappears, entertainment becomes an industry of repetition, not of invention. Is that what we want? Is safety, in the broad risk-averse sense, an adequate substitute for the messy human unpredictability that makes culture vital? These are rhetorical questions the piece is meant to ask. They're also practical ones we all face. Where do we draw the line between accountability and suffocation? Eli's private life became opaque in ways that everyone respected. He married. He had children. He moved his life into the margins. The tabloids could still find him when necessary, but the cameras were softer, the coverage sanitized. You can protect a person with legal fences. You cannot completely control the human impulse to wonder. There were moments of tenderness we rarely saw. At home, Eli was different. He taught his daughter how to ride a bike on a cracked neighborhood court. He listened to his son's homework problems with a patience that surprised even his closest friends. These were his acts of restoration, small domestic rebellions against the machine that had tried to own him. If public retreat is a strategy, private cultivation is a therapy. He rediscovered simple pleasures, a long walk at dawn, an unedited recording session where no one cared whether the take would be used, the comfort of being anonymous in a grocery store. These things mattered. But they were also evidence that the old hunger was still inside, perhaps dormant by choice. Rhett's life followed a different arc. He refused the delicate lattice of private counsel and corporate loyalty. He didn't refuse to court trouble. He just refused to let anyone else write the margin notes of his life. He would sell out theaters because people trusted his voice. He attacked power directly, often in ways that made executives uncomfortable. He learned to make himself indispensable to crowds, not networks. This independence bought him a peculiar immunity. When he mocked people with power, the consequences were mostly financial for the critics, not bodily for him. He didn't need the studio's handshake. That autonomy allowed him to speak in riddles, in metaphors, in jokes that cut like a compass. Why are some people able to sustain dangerous art and others aren't? The answer again collapses into a cluster of practicalities. Money, platforms, networks, temperament. A comedian who owns their means of distribution, tours, a loyal audience, is less vulnerable to corporate retribution. A film actor who depends on studios is more vulnerable. And the decisions that look like personal moral choices are often logistical ones. The system appears impartial and mechanical, but it is deeply social. Power is embedded in relationship. If the relationships change, the art changes as well. Behind the curtains of all these public narratives, the industry cultivated an unspoken rule. You may be beloved, even dangerous, until the calculus of keeping you becomes riskier than letting you go. At that point, they will engineer a quiet solution. That solution might be a settlement, a shift in roles offered, or simply the slow evaporation of opportunities. Eli's story had echoes across a generation. A theater that once thrummed with risque creativity became a conservatory of safe bets. New stars learned the lesson quickly. Say less. Be present enough to sell tickets. Avoid friction. It is impossible to know whether such prudence preserves careers or ensures anemic output. The human cost is undeniable. It robs performers and audiences alike of the possibilities that sharp edges bring. The narrative around power, then, has two faces. On one hand, the machine is protective and corrective. On the other hand, it's a sterilizing force that slices risk from the cultural diet. Both are true, which is why the issue is so unsatisfying. It resists moral certainty. Was it worth it? Someone asks near the end of the pieces that examine Eli's life. Worth what? Preservation? Freedom? Legacy? The answers are private and scattered. Eli's friends said he looked relieved. Critics said he looked diminished. He looked like a man who had learned what he could not unlearn. What did they show him? Perhaps they showed him the edges of a machine he had long suspected but had never entirely seen. Once seen, you can't unsee. Once seen, you change. Rhett's role in all this is as a provocateur and a witness. He is the one who points and asks the obvious question with the most abrasive smile. If you were shown enough truth to make silence feel like safety, what did they show you? He knows the answer will not be printed in court documents. It will live, instead, in the choices people make. What is the remedy, if any? There are no elegant fixes. Greater transparency in institutions helps. Better accountability. A culture that is willing to encourage risk while maintaining guardrails against abuse. But these are structural answers that require a willingness to change systems that benefit from opacity. In the private rooms where the wealthy and powerful meet, secrets are rarely currency only because they are harmful. They are currency because secrecy can be monetized. Exposure devalues that currency. That is the economic logic of secrecy. The moral work, therefore, is to reduce the value of what secrecy protects. This is why public pressure matters. Yet public pressure rarely translates directly into structural reform. Instead, it often produces theatrical punishments. The second-order consequence is that the people who survive the spectacle, whether proven guilty or merely tainted by proximity, recalibrate their lives in ways that are invisible to the live audience but palpable in the art they no longer make. The story of Eli Knox is not a story that ends with a verdict. It's an ongoing case study in trade-offs. He survives, with his children, with his faith, with quiet Sundays. He loses the dangerous version of himself the culture once adored. The loss is mourned by a segment of the audience who once loved unpredictability. The industry, meanwhile, breathes easier. In the end, the question this tale leaves you with is simple and unsettling. When survival requires the sacrifice of danger, what do we lose along with the danger? We lose invention. We lose the possibility that someone's art will shock us into new thinking. We lose cultural risk that, while sometimes reckless, often produces the very breakthroughs the market later commodifies. Eli's choice was his alone to make. It was shaped by fear and love and preservation and an understanding of the limits of his control. He kept his dignity and his children. He abandoned the teeth that made him thrilling. Who can blame him? Who can judge? And so Rhett's cryptic pronouncements remain the most honest commentary on the phenomenon. He isn't trying to indict Eli. He's trying to measure the cost of a system that disciplines its brilliant men and women into safe predictability. In the end, the most effective control often comes without violence. It comes as an education in risk. Once you have been shown the cost of being wild, you will often choose to be tame. That is the real miracle of power. It shapes desire not by force, but by lesson. And the final question, the one that sits in this fictionalized, expanded telling like a stone at the center of a pond, is the one the reader is left to answer for themselves. If you were shown enough about the mechanisms that manage fame, would you choose to dim your light, or would you risk everything to keep it burning? There is no single right answer. The story does not resolve neatly with a confession or a trial. It closes with a recognition of how complicated survival is, how often it involves small mercies and large compromises. It invites us to wonder, to ask, and to watch who gets to make those choices, and why. And perhaps the truest question of all is the most personal. What would you do, standing where they stand, with everything you loved at stake?